I'm talking with Dr. Terrell Carter, and the book we're talking about is Daniel and God's Sovereignty. Dr. Carter is a pastor, professor, and executive director all at once, and that's probably a good set of skills to have in reading Daniel because Daniel's got a lot of those jobs. Uh, so, what led you to talk about God's sovereignty, particularly out of the first six chapters of Daniel?
The idea came from a sermon series that I preached at the congregation church where I serve as pastor uh, in the midst of COVID. Like everyone else, nobody anticipated this, you know, coming about or happening, and it struck us. It shook us in many ways, our congregation, and the world in general. And the question for me became, how do we start addressing the kinds of questions that are universal and have been asked for so long? Like, where is God when bad things are happening? Where is God when it seems like we can't hear from the one who created us? Where is God when it seems like God is just being silent? And I think that if you are a Christian and went to any amount of Sunday school, then you've read the book of Daniel. And my hope was not to look at it like we would or like we did when we were kids, but to engage with those tough questions. So it's not just about miracles. It's, why did a miracle need to happen in the first place if God really was sovereign? Why would God have to go through such great measures to free Daniel and his comrades instead of just protecting them in the first place? Why did they end up where they were? Their entire community being destroyed and taken captive and moved to a different land. Why would that happen in the first place if God was so loving and powerful and had made all these promises to people in the past? So that's a long way of saying I just thought it was relevant in the sense because of what the world was facing during COVID and what our congregation, and then to be truthful, what I have been facing on a personal level. As a pastor, I don't just preach to other people. I don't just research and like give information for other people. To be honest, many times it's addressing something that I am or a loved one who's really, close to me that they are navigating through. So it's a spiritual work for me, myself.
What really interested me in looking at this particular book, and I'll follow this up with a question, but it's first as a comment, is you have on the one hand, you have the Bible stories, which I learned. You have a class when you're a kid and you Daniel in the lion's den and all that good stuff, and it works out really well. And then I had the other side when I got a little bit older, which is everybody is coming in to try to find out what's happening in the last days out of the last set of chapters.
Right.
And the two pieces never seem to get together.
Right.
And that, so it really interested me in looking at your at your book, is that you're reading the theology out of the stories out of the first part.
Mm-hmm.
So just I'll give you a moment if you want to comment anything on the relationship on that and the importance of hearing that part of the book of Daniel if you're going to understand what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. It's very clear. So we don't have time in this interview to go over everything about the entire book of Daniel, obviously. But so this first book about Daniel, chapters 1 through 6 are available. And I am obviously working on the second Daniel book, which deals with 7 through 12, which is that kind of end times prophecy kind of thing. And the question is actually that book answers, is it really talking about the end times? Is it really talking about prophecy, or is it something else? So the challenge with reading the entire book of Daniel is you get this theology of God's presence, God's omnipotence, or the questions about God's presence, the questions about God's omnipotence. The word you used earlier in a separate conversation was theodicy. But the second half of the book of Daniel, chapter 7 through 12, kind of still deal with that question, because the belief is that when that portion of the book was written, or what that portion of the book addresses is, like, what is life really like after Daniel and his friends and the people that had previously been in captivity are freed. And Daniel chapter 7 through 12 seeks to address those kinds of questions of, what does life look like when we have, God has showed God's self to be sovereign, we are now free. And they use the stories in Daniel chapter 7 through 12 to try to tell that story and address those things. But again, that's for a different interview. But Daniel 1 through 6, again, it's important theology. It's the questions that, many times we, growing up, if we are told that good Christians don't ask those kind of questions. You just take everything by faith. You just trust that God. Well, that's not really how the Bible is shaped and how the Bible reads, if you are really paying attention to it. There are places in the Bible where the writer clearly believes that God is in control. And then there are very clear portions in the Bible where the writer does not believe that God is in control, and they are asking, where is God? And that can be from like one book itself. In the Psalms, you have multiple sections where the writer clearly articulates a faith that God is, and that because God is, everything's going to be all right. And then, just a few uh, spaces over, they're like, wait a minute, like, why am I trusting you? Because you haven't done what you said you would do. And it's not like the writer is being heretical or being disrespectful. They are just in a moment where they need their faith to be reaffirmed. And I believe some of those same things are true for the book of Daniel, especially chapters 1 through 6, where, we have been taken from our homeland. We have no idea what's going to happen to us in the future. Okay, some good things start happening to us, and we have new positions, we given new authority. But wait a minute, now people are trying to remove us and hurt us and trying to double cross us and all those things. And now, like, my life is in danger. What does that mean? Wait a minute, I'm just standing up for my faith, for what I believe, what God told me would happen, what's really going to happen. And, we may not face lions on a daily basis, literal lions, but we face those kinds of choices and those kinds of circumstances. And we have the opportunity to, not just think about these things, but to either live them out or to work through what it means to have these things as part of the foundation of our faith.
It reminded me of something interesting there. One of my other authors, named Alden Thompson, wrote a book, Who's Afraid of the Old Testament God? And the chapter on the Psalms is titled, What Kind of Prayers Would You Publish If You Were God? Because of the really wild nature of some of the Psalms. Let me bring this kind of into focus and probably conclude the interview here, because this is a book I'm going to say, of course, I'm the publisher. I'm always supposed to say that people are supposed to read this book, but especially with the various currents that we see in the world today in politics and society and so on, it's a book that addresses an important question. And I would draw that kind of out of Daniel 4 with my own experience, when I'll say, to people, calm down about what's going on. The Lord God rules in the kingdom of man. And I think it's the KJV says, and setteth up over them whomsoever he will.
Right.
Even the basest, I think basest is the word the KJV used, of men. And what I'll immediately get after that is the question, well, then should I go out and vote, etc.? And I'm kind of puzzled, because my answer would be a yes.
Right.
I do. And to me, Daniel, who was putting putting pen to paper, was certainly active.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord God may rule, but Daniel wasn't exactly neglecting his duties.
No,
So
not at all.
comment on, maybe I give that a chance to say, here's the nutshell.
Yeah, I mean,
Or here's the big subject you can't find the word enough words for.
right. Well, again, I think it gets back to this idea of what is our place in this relationship that we're trying to build with God, or that God has invited us to be a part of. We could just throw in the towel and say, I'm just sitting here and I will do nothing because I'm either afraid or I'm disappointed or because, a myriad of reasons. Or we could say, God has called me and given me this opportunity to be a part of what this new kingdom that God is creating, that Jesus talks about in the New Testament, not some far off world, not some place way out in the clouds or some spiritual plane, but this new world that is being created through us adopting and living into these principles that not just the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament gives us, but the New Testament as well. And we have an opportunity to, I would, as a writer, I would say put pen to paper, but put feet to concrete and to do something and to be involved in something, to engage in something, knowing that ultimately God, as Daniel, I believe, would say, and as you just said, God is in control in a big picture kind of sense. But God also allows us to participate and to help bring about whatever outcomes, are made.
Okay, well, thank you for your time, Dr. Carter. I'll remind everybody, the book is Daniel and God's Sovereignty. And we'll have information on how to order it here right at the end. And I certainly hope you will take a look at it because it has some important stuff to say about the book of Daniel in ways that are often neglected.
Thank you for having me on.